Welcome everybody to the July 15th meeting of the IMAG MSM Working Group on Multiscale Modeling in Viral Pandemics. I'm very excited today to have two distinguished science journalists who will talk to us about communication and have an opportunity for discussion about your ideas and issues. I need to remind you that the meeting is being live streamed on YouTube and is recorded, and that the meeting will be available archivally for public viewing. As always, Reinhard and myself are always available to take your comments, questions, and suggestions. And Jim Sluka and Bruce Shapiro are also available. So please contact us with any issues, concerns, ideas, suggestions for how we can make things work better. We have our usual communication channels. We appreciate your help keeping them up to date and using them. As always, we have our YouTube recordings of these meetings. They're a great resource. Please help us get the word out about that resource. It's a tremendous collection of expertise and ideas, and we'd like to see people take advantage of it. Now I turn it over to announcements. Are there any short announcements people would like to make today? We have a reminder that there is the Predictive Intelligence for Pandemic Prevention Phase 1 planning grants announced by NSF that are due October 1st. Those are about $1 million, so they're large for planning grants. I suspect a lot of people in this community would be interested in those. And there's also a new RFA on diversity, which has an unbelievably short deadline for letters of intent and full proposals, and then a huge amount of funding. And so I don't know much about that program. I know that we were asked to announce it. It's an interesting opportunity, but I'm not exactly sure how you put together a $20 million proposal in 3 weeks. But it's of interest, and we were asked to make that announcement. Coming up next week, we have Angela Reynolds, who wrote the wonderful review paper on multiscale modeling of lung infection, and Reinhard, who has been patiently listening but hasn't spoken yet to the group. The following week, Gary Ann is going to be talking about the difference between human and bat immunology. And Keisuke Ejima is going to be talking about combining in-host models with population models of epidemiology, which is something we've talked about a lot and heard only a few talks on so far. We would very much like to have your suggestions for future speakers. If everybody in the room suggested a speaker, that would be wonderful to fill up our calendar. Feel free to suggest yourself as a speaker, of course. Lateral thinking of people, for example, clinicians who could define problems, open problems that need to be addressed computationally, data sources, examples from other fields. Please be open-minded in your suggestions of speakers. We want to have as much diversity in these talks as possible, and we'd very much appreciate your help in filling them up. So please send those suggestions to me, Reinhard, Bruce, and Jim. John Rice, of course, is very active in soliciting speakers and helping us with that as well, so you could include him on the CC. We look forward to your ideas, but if everybody suggests one person, we'll have enough people to speak till the end of the year, so that would be great. I don't know exactly what format Martha would like to use here. But typically we will ask you to mute when you're not speaking. I'll give our speaker a 5-minute warning. She has a hard deadline of 4 o'clock, so we're going to have a slightly different format. Aleszu is able to speak with us a little bit longer. So she'll give her presentation, then we'll have a discussion session with her. Then Aleszu will speak, and then we'll have the discussion section with him afterwards. So it'll be a slightly different format from our usual one, but I hope that will work out for people. And without further ado, people know that I don't do elaborate introductions. I take enough time as it is. So I will turn it over to Martha to speak.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm very honored that you would take time away from your extremely important research to listen to myself and Aleszu talk about communication. But as somebody who teaches science communication, I also think it's really important because I hate for brilliant work to be going on or important findings to be happening and not being disseminated and shared with the vast public. I think a huge piece of this pandemic has been poor communication and so poor understanding in the public about where the science lies. With that said, I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint presentation about communicating with journalists. There are few enough of us here that if you want to if I say something that doesn't make sense, just please interrupt me and we will just talk about it. So how to communicate science with journalists, which I think all of you have some experience with. Basically, we have overlapping goals. You're building knowledge through research and experimentation, very simply put. We are informing, engaging, and hopefully empowering our American public and our international readers. But together, we all want transparency. We all want our work to have impact. We all want accountability. Accuracy is something that is really important to all of us, and fairness. And so that in that overlap area, I believe, is where our communication begins. 5 ways to effectively communicate with us. Number 1, find the right reporter. So I have, often it's not scientists, often it's like a university PR department that's reaching out to me. But if you see a reporter writing about something that you know something about, and maybe they got it wrong, maybe there's something more deeply that to be explored there. I'll go into each of these with more detail, but find the right reporter. I have people reach out to me with huge story ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with anything I would ever write about. Once you find the right reporter, be patient and understanding. You might have a study coming out and you want it published in the newspaper in 2 days, but we have a lot of things on our agendas as well. And so we can take much longer than people find satisfying. If you can bring new and accurate information to journalists, that's going to kick us into gear. And I'm going to just briefly talk about FOIA, because you are in institutions, a lot of you in public ones, or are working with public institutions where you know what to make freedom of information requests for. We don't. Bring us real people. So don't just have talking heads and experts. If you can provide us with somebody who is the real life example of what it is you're talking about, that's going to help. And then don't spin. So don't overplay something or exaggerate, because that's where we'll walk away if we feel like someone's not being honest and transparent. Let me dive into these a little bit deeper. Find the right reporter. So look for relevant articles that people are writing on these topics, and then reach out to the reporter in ways that might not be so comfortable for you, but LinkedIn, Facebook, a lot of journalists are on Twitter, so you have to direct message them. Email, I say, please don't blind call. A lot of us journalists actually do make our phone numbers fairly public, but if you call out of the blue with a story idea, I'm not necessarily going to be able to be attentive to you and to what it is you're suggesting. If you can, through one of those other systems, schedule a 10-minute call. Assume you're going to have to reach out to 10 to 20 reporters to get one to respond. I have hundreds of pitches a day. And then all mediums matter: radio, TV, print, online. So think about what audience you want to reach. Are you thinking younger? Are you thinking an NPR type audience? Are you thinking more mainstream news? That number 2 rule that I suggested, be patient and understanding. Please give us a 5 to 7 days advance warning. Last week, I got a really important study about detention of migrant children, which was a topic I wrote about a year ago a lot. And how every single country in the world addresses it. And they were giving me an embargoed copy that would publish in 2 days. They knew that was coming. A week or 2 in advance would have meant that I would do a story, but getting it 2 days in advance meant I couldn't do a story. So offer everything early. Don't be dejected if you get rejected by a reporter. Keep coming back to us. If we're telling you we're interested, a lot of times we can't do a story because we're doing something else where there's not a lot of us. Be heard above the noise by being personal. So, in our 10-minute conversation, let's get to know each other a little bit. And then when you reach out to me, I know who you are, you know who I am. A lot of you have done work that would be really relevant to my reporting. Provide context. So you are such experts. And so I'm just going to say deep in the weeds on a lot of topics, but we need to have a better understanding, but what does it mean for everybody? So you have to be both simple and complicated with us. And know that you cannot control the story. You're not going to get to decide when it goes, how long it is, or even how it's framed. You can influence by being very clear with us, but you can check your quotes. And I'm not sure everyone realizes this. You can tell me or any other journalist, yes, I'll talk to you on the record, but I want to check my quotes. And what that means is I would email you back how I'm quoting you. And typically, if you're like, that doesn't quite make sense that way, can we change it a little bit? Typically, I'm going to be okay with that. That's still something you said. If you said something really outrageous, I would not be comfortable with changing the meaning. But particularly with science and scientists, we just want clarity. And when we're talking, it's hard to necessarily be perfectly clear. So it's okay to check your quotes. Bring new and accurate information. So when we talk about new and accurate information, we like analyzed data. Like I've looked at all of these studies and you are particularly good at trends, spikes. We can tell you, Martha, what's coming up. Peer-reviewed findings that are not yet published, real-time test results that, we've just sampled all these people and found this. We love photographs and video. If you have some of that has not seen the light of day on your topic, we love that. Databases, and also, as I mentioned before, using FOIA, and I'll explain that more in a moment. But this was a study early on in COVID where they were looking at what protects what protects the spread of COVID. And it was a peer-reviewed study done rather quickly. And this type of information is actually newsworthy at a time when the federal government was suggesting we should use a bandana if we don't have a mask. And so this is a scientific study of masks that prompts a news article compared to just saying the public health messaging that everyone should, put something on their face. Freedom of information. I don't feel like scientists use this enough. You know much better than we do what is in a grant application, what the NIH and other federal science organizations have in their collections behind firewalls. The point of this law is that we should shine the light in on government. We own this information, but a lot of us journalists don't know what scientific data is kind of being held by the federal government or by local or state governments. And so if you can file a FOIA or tell us what to ask for, that's almost always going to prompt a news story. Just the idea that a democracy works best when the people have all the information that the security of the nation permits. And so I encourage this. Anyone can file a FOIA. Response can take 20 days to 15 years, but you might know very specific language, very specific names to ask for, very specific communications and emails to request. All federal agencies are subject to it. All state agencies are also subject to records laws. Costs can be waived for researchers, or if you're telling us what we should request, we can have cost waives. Photos, videos, audio, and databases are all records that can be requested. And there's no special form. There's templates online at every agency site. There are exceptions for national security, trade secrets, even things like dams, but there's a lot of material that you might know about that we don't know about that would be newsworthy. This is an example of bringing new and accurate information through a FOIA. This was to the Treasury Secretary, and it was talking about US Postal Service loans. Only people who knew what to request would know to ask for that, but it turned into a good news story. Okay, bring real people. And then I'm just going to go into a couple stories that I've done in the past year about COVID, where we've been working with scientists closely and kind of randomly trying to find them quickly. This is a nurse who passed away from COVID early on. She had told her supervisors that she was getting exposed to patients with COVID, and they did not supply her with enough PPE. And so the National Nurses Union brought her friends and family to us, introduced them to us, so that we could have not just that data I showed you of N95s are best for protecting people, but look, here's real life. People are dying over this because they don't have adequate protection while they're caring for people with COVID. And then finally, don't spin. So we just start to disregard anybody who tells us that anything that is spin. Once we get a bit of spin, it's hard to take any other pieces of what they're providing us with as seriously. So we began last year with a lot of questions that we were going to turn to researchers, including people who do the type of work you do. Are healthcare workers running out of supplies, and if so, why? There was tons of misinformation. There was obvious frontline shortages, and we actually found real-time data to back it up. But we had to work around shelter in place. We had to work around travel bans, which for journalists, we just like to knock on people's doors. We like to talk to strangers. So we could see the cases were going up. We could see that healthcare providers literally didn't have adequate protection. And so then we began looking at the federal procurement data system to see what the federal government was doing to buy, to protect people from COVID. We looked at import records and export records to see what was coming in and going out of the United States. And we saw that imports had stopped. There were no more N95 masks coming into the United States. We crunched our own data, but we sure would like it if other people would do this as well, to show how shipments had plummeted. This, I'm showing you Panjiva, which is just a way of showing import data. You can see where it came from, where it went to, when it arrived in the United States, et cetera. And then we were able to, say, okay, in March 2019, there were 13 shipments, 24 shipping containers arriving in the United States of N95s. By March 2020, there were 3 shipments and 6 shipping containers arriving in the US. So at the time when there was this huge shortage, there also was a huge drop in shipments. And that by October 2020, in that month, there were 2,000 plus shipments. And that leads to partly why we have such a glut now. Another question we asked is, why are healthcare providers running out of rubber gloves? And unlike most PPE made in China, 3 out of 4 gloves are made in Malaysia. The Malaysian government had halted factory work to control COVID-19. The US Customs and Border Protection had banned imports of rubber gloves, citing labor abuse. And this has continued to just last week. And then we worked with advocates who are going after all of these glove makers, who put us in touch with people who are immigrants in Malaysia and spend their days making gloves. And just one, I'm just going to share one last one, which was actually not even that one. What's happening to those people without PPE? And this was some research that we really went all around trying to find people doing this, which is, how were warnings from frontline workers playing out, and whose voices need to be heard? And it ended up really just being nurses we needed to talk to a lot. These people had walked out of COVID care rooms because they did not have N95 masks. We also tracked down counterfeit PPE. We looked at the CDC counterfeit warnings. We realized we'd see ear loops on things that were supposed to be N95s that would have a head loop. We used Google Images to comb the web for more. And then we found people who had been buying them, and we got all their receipts and purchase orders. And we got colleagues in China to visit the address of the factory where these were coming from. And you could see the ear loops were deemed counterfeit. And so then at the factory, our colleagues were approached by many people offering to sell them these fake N95 masks. And then we asked, when the vaccine is ready, will the US be ready? So there was whistleblowers who were saying there was a needle and syringe shortage. The federal procurement data system, which shows how US money is being spent, didn't show any needle and syringe contracts at all. Operation Warp Speed was investing in unknowns for injection systems. And then we found a startup that was tapped to inject the country, and they said themselves they should be a backup, not the first responder. The federal government got so mad at our questions, they said, we've lost interest in assisting your story, which doesn't make any sense to me because they work for us. But in the end, we were reporting by mid last year that the US was betting on an untested company to deliver the COVID-19 vaccine, and they still have not met their promise, and they got more money than any other vaccine maker. So that, I'm going to stop my share and see. Yeah, see if anyone has questions at this point. I just kind of wanted to give you a peek into like how we work and how those stories actually come about.
Hey, maybe this is a dumb question, but whenever I do something that I think might be newsworthy, I just go through the university press office. Is that a good strategy or a bad one?
I don't know who's on this call. So I don't know if the university press office is on this call, but I can tell you they put out press releases. So they don't typically build a lot of these relationships that I'm talking about. There's a scientist at UCLA who tests seafood to find out if it's accurate or not. And he contacted me because I was doing some stories about seafood fraud years ago. And now he just keeps me apprised of his research. And when he's 2 or 3 weeks out, he'll contact me and say, hey, here's what we're finding. Do you want it first? I will eventually get a university press release on it, but that's not nearly as likely to get a really good story done as you working with a journalist. And I mean, I know different universities have different rules about this. So sometimes it's working hand in hand. A lot of the time I'll reach out to a scientist who's like, yes, I really want to talk to you about pharmaceuticals in drinking water. We have to go through the press office. But at that point, the press office is really good at facilitating setting up meetings or arranging for our video cameras to come in. But it's a much better story if we can come into your labs or even, get video or audio of you tapping away at your computer databases, whatever it looks like. It's going to be a better story. So if you see a reporter writing about something and you think that what you're researching would be of interest to that reporter, personal outreach is great. And it can be off the record. It can be initially, hey, can I have an off the record discussion with you initially? I just want to share what my research is and find out if you're interested.
Thanks.
Martha, can you talk just a little bit about your background, so a few words?
Sure. I have been at the Associated Press for 25 years. I have been assigned in Thailand, in Mexico City, Silicon Valley beat. And I'm currently on an investigative team, which some news organizations have and some don't. I won a Pulitzer Prize in 2000 for tracking down the perpetrators of a war crime in South Korea, where they had shot and killed hundreds of South Koreans, the US Army had, and the US government had denied that the incident occurred. And we found out it had. We found the survivors, we found the perpetrators, and we found the archival documents proving it. I also won a Pulitzer Prize in 2016 where we tracked, we found people who were enslaved on an island, thousands of men enslaved, forced to catch fish in Indonesia. And we tracked their seafood back to Walmart and Whole Foods and everywhere else in the US. And that story led to thousands of men being freed. The problem continues, I would say, terribly with slavery and seafood. And I'm happy to talk about human trafficking in the seafood industry, Reinhardt. But every couple years, I shift beats a little bit. So a for a few years, I was writing about the detention of migrant children under Trump. Then when COVID hit, I actually was planning to do a deep dive into the hidden costs of dollar stores, looking at labor abuse abroad, OSHA violations here, all the toxins in the stuff in the dollar stores, what they do to communities and all the other hidden costs. But because of COVID, we shifted gears and wrote about PPE. Right now, I am writing about AI, actually, in terms of a range of things, from all the apps that governments around the world have put into people's phones to track COVID and what consequences might be of that, to AI with predictive policing. I'm also doing a really interesting project right now where I'm talking to people who are convicted of hate crimes to try to figure out what motivated them and see if there's like a financial behind all that, so that when somebody who and I'm bases in the United States, so really all over the map right now. Hopefully next year I'll be more focused on one topic, but as investigative reporters, we often do find ourselves just kind of moving in different directions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Haley, I have a question. As a reporter, you strive for objectivity. At the same time, you need to get the story out before completion. So how do you balance out those kind of force?
Through fairness, right? Because we need to ask everybody the questions. We need to listen very carefully. And then we have many, many layers to hold ourselves accountable. We have our own editors who may say, Martha, you know what, you need to go back and talk to 10 more people. You don't have enough perspectives here. We have a standards editor who makes sure all of our stories adhere to a very strict sense of standards that we publish, those standards. And then we also are different from other like non-news organizations in that we correct ourselves. So if we get something wrong, we will issue a correction. If InfoWars publishes something that's not true, they don't need to necessarily put out a correction. And so that's kind of where we hold ourselves accountable as well. We hate to publish corrections. We try to get it right the first time, but we're moving very, very quickly. And I should have mentioned, Reinhardt, like every reporter at the Associated Press, I also cover breaking news. So every year I find myself on the front lines of wildfires. I've gone to, I don't know how many mass shootings now, dating back toward like school shooting days around Columbine time. So we also all cover spot news.
Sorry, I refer to you as Haley. I mean, I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
I apologize.
No problem.
Okay.
I hope I answered your question enough. I think it's a really important thing for people to understand that in this era of fake news and propaganda and lies going out, I think it's really important for people to understand how journalists with kind of more mainstream news organizations are held accountable and how we really work to get every perspective. We are not pushing, we don't come into it with one perspective. We're curious about these things.
Great, thanks.
So I have a follow-up question. So Martha, you gave us a lot of good advice on how to get our stories out. And but let me ask you, maybe at a higher level, from your point of view, what do you think the responsibility of scientists is beyond doing good science? In terms of communicating it and in terms of placing it in correctly within society?
I mean, this is really my opinion is that research, you need to take it the next step and have, because it can have in the world, it's a little bit more straightforward. But I think that the hard work you do can have a really big impact. And I think it's important to think about ways to do that. But I also think because you are experts, and there are so many people who would be experts but aren't actual experts, that it's really critical to weigh in with that. Look, you've studied this for decades, whatever this topic is. Other people are opining and editorializing and weighing in on it, but you have decades and decades of experience. When I break my foot, I don't go to, my neighbor who has a lot of advice about broken feet. I go to the person who went to medical school and knows how to take care of this. And so I feel like you're those experts. And so when you can weigh in with your gravitas, I think those are very important voices to be heard.
I guess I was going to ask, we had a beautiful talk a few weeks ago from Philip Ball, talking about the intersection between science, medicine, and politics and society, and the fact that they can't be decoupled, and the COVID has shown that they can't be decoupled. I think many people in this room have been surprised by some of the things, for example, that have come out of the CDC in the past 6 months. And I wondered if you had done any work trying to understand that nexus of political and scientific decisions, because all decisions, of course, policy decisions are legitimately political decisions. I guess science informs, but it doesn't make decisions. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about if you've had any experience in some of these policy decisions and the role of science, and could help us understand just a little bit about that. If not, that's fine, but I wondered if those are issues you've addressed.
Yeah, most recently, very specifically about N95 masks. The CDC recommendation did not shift back to the tested and found the finding that those masks should be worn one time, not from one patient to the next. When the shortages started, they did have to, the CDC and NIOSH and FDA had to come out with guidelines for emergency use, right? That you're going to have to ration these. But now there's abundant supply. And in fact, there's US companies making them that are going bankrupt. There's a US company that has, the owner will call me and say, I have 10 tractor trailers packed with these things in my parking lot right now in Fort Worth, Texas. And the hospitals are still saying, no single use on these. And so the CDC guidelines, I feel like were being impacted by procurement specialists or hospitals or medical suppliers. All of that was playing a role in their decision rather than just the basic science. So that's one area, but I also, just what you were saying,
I'm sorry, your internet is cutting out a little bit. If you could repeat that, your internet cut out there.
Those players accountable. What does the medicine say? What do the politicians say? What does the government say? Our job is to be that fourth pillar of democracy and say, here's what everybody else is doing in this space and who's influencing who.
I have a question if we've got time for one more. I'm a grad student, so I don't have decades of experience. And I think that I can speak for a lot of smaller labs and people closer to the student age group when I say that our research often feels very limited in terms of the types of questions that you're talking about addressing in this talk. Particularly when it comes to biology, it's very complicated. You might be studying one niche protein on this one disease or this one specific pathway, right? It's something very small that fits together into a larger picture. If you want to put that small piece or your small piece into a larger picture, is that something that reporters or just, I guess, scientific reporting in science can help with, because ideally you should be able to do that through literature, but it can be a very slow process.
Yeah, and we don't require decades of experience. We require expertise. We respect academia. We respect real research where you're looking at something. So if there is, one slight thing that you are learning about that can impact down the road lung cancer or something, there's a bigger picture there. And so I think it's sometimes, I teach science communication in a master's degree program where the students mostly have a master's or PhD and then have looked up and said, I don't want to spend my life in a lab. I want to be communicating this stuff. And so I start by asking them, well, what was your master's degree research, or what was your dissertation on? And boiling it down until they can really explain it in layman's terms and why it matters. Why are you doing that research? Are you trying to bring about a positive change? So I think that I didn't mean to discount our younger scientists. I think your work is deeply important, and as long as you can provide context, I think if it's important and it has an impact, it should be shared.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. Thank you so much. That was really one of the things that you clarified very helpfully for us. It was the difference between the roles of, we tend to think of journalism as a monolith. And so whether we're talking to the communication officer at our university, whether we're talking to a popular science writer or an investigative reporter, these are very different roles.
Yeah.
So it was very, very helpful to us, I think, to be able to see the perspective of an investigative reporter, which is probably something that many of us don't get to talk to very often. And so that was extremely helpful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm sorry we don't have more time for the conversation, but it was really, really enlightening for us.
Great. Thank you.
All right, do I kick this off? Or the second part? Thank you, Martha.
So let me just put up the caption. So we'll move to our second talk from Aleszu. Is it? I should have asked your name. Pronounce it Bajak.
Bajak, yeah.
Bajak.
Perfect.
And we appreciate you very much being willing to come and speak with us. And I will turn the screen share back to you.
Thank you. And that's, Martha and I, we should get a virtual coffee because she's worked with my dad, who was at the AP for 35 years. And so they've worked together, but we have not gotten a chance. So I learned a lot from that talk as well. Okay, so let me share my screen and hopefully you can see these keynote slides. Can everyone see them?
Yes.
It's
Great,
in
thank
your
you so much.
desktop mode rather than your presenter mode, but whichever way you like.
Sure, yeah, let's do this as long as you can see it. It's so funny. I taught a class on Zoom and I still can't get it right. Okay, so here we go. This is stuff I wanted to talk about. As you saw the three things I kind of wanted to touch on. Some that Martha talked a lot about, in terms of roles within journalism, ways to engage and get stories placed, or just kind of help us all get these messages across. And then I wanted to kind of jump into a little bit of modeling and how the public and journalists were engaging with and communicating models, and how hopefully you guys could all help. So first on me, right out of college, I was doing a lot more of kind of fooling around in the lab than actually building and assaying and doing all the other stuff. But I worked in gene therapy for 3 years. It was interesting, and we're really full circle with adenovirus vectors in COVID. So it's been kind of a weird experience. But in the intervening years, I basically, eventually kind of followed in my father's footsteps and made my own way back into journalism, right, from science. So I was a radio producer at Science Friday. I freelanced abroad, lived in Argentina, lived in Peru, grew up in Colombia, and wrote about a bunch of different topics across science. And I fell in love because I got to learn from smart people like yourselves. Every week I could jump into a new story, and it was invigorating. And so then in 2013, I moved to Boston. I did this Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT, which meant I got a sabbatical from journalism and got to go take classes again and build, your sources, build your Rolodex or continue to build it. And I was thinking a lot about data. I was thinking a lot about my, really rudimentary web kind of development skills and how that was becoming a kind of growing area in journalism: data visualization, data storytelling, and of course, data analysis that powers a lot of the stories like Martha was talking about, and what I get to do now, which I'm doing at USA Today on the data team. And in the between 2013 and now, I was essentially at Northeastern for most of that time, which meant I was teaching classes like science communication classes, science journalism classes, but also a lot of kind of data and coding heavy classes, trying to kind of bridge this divide of what is kind of being revealed through the data and through the interviews and through our talks with sources like yourselves, and how do we best present that to audiences, and how do we best present that in 2021, right? And so there's a lot of bells and whistles. You've probably seen things like the New York Times Upshot or any number of interactive visualizations that the major players are building, and we'll get into some of those. But I was really drawn to that. And now have been able to, and just quickly on my role in terms of what I cover, from 10 years of covering science and health, in Nature and Undark and other magazines like those. I'm definitely someone who's covering science a lot. Obviously, the Miami condo collapse in the last 2 weeks, like Martha was saying too, we do all kind of break away from our larger projects to do breaking news. You won't imagine how many engineers I've spoken to in the last 2 weeks, and climate scientists and the like. So that's always really fun. But we'll get to kind of tips for how to kind of engage on stories like that. But I also get to kind of do larger, deeper investigations, like Martha mentioned Operation Warp Speed, looking at one of the tools that they tapped Palantir to build, and that's this middle story here. This kind of state by state tracker was supposed to give them, kind of a bird's eye view of what was going on. And then it started with a simple question, which was, are the states even using this? And so we went around and we asked every single state, the health departments, are you using this? And essentially everyone said they built a tool that no one uses. We have better data ourselves. And they never gave access to the counties, which is where the COVID vaccines were being organized and doled out. So really, it was a kind of something kind of sold by Palantir and the federal government that never actually made it down to the boots on the ground, right, where the shots were getting into arms. And then I also do things like social media analysis, drawn from my experience at Northeastern covering or working with the network scientists and the computational social scientists on these questions of what can social media tell us about what culture is saying? What can it tell us about what elites are saying, or what messaging is coming from governments, or what, say, people, the general public, the commons is saying about an issue. And then, of course, misinformation and disinformation and those kinds of things. So I'm really interested in the kind of quantitative tools to measure those things, and where that differs from the past in terms of what we used to do to understand surveys, polls, other ways of the societal barometers, right? So these are three things I wanted to kind of touch on, right? Which was models and kind of communicating science more generally, failures and successes of media, especially I guess during COVID. I think that might be something we can all talk about, and then a quick kind of tips on op-eds. It's a kind of a strong way for you all to get a kind of message across that really leapfrogs a lot of the reporters and a lot of the press officers at your institutions, and a well put op-ed can say a lot and can really make waves. So I love these memes, the data scientist one, the machine learning, the deep learning one's really funny too. But there's obviously kind of 6 kernels of truth with these 6 memes, right? Because this is what we're talking about when we're talking about science communication and the what the public kind of understands when they read something like an abstract that you've written, right? If they even get that far, right? Or if they get to your faculty bio or your research page. It's a kind of an interesting way to think, hey, if someone knew nothing about what I do, how would they characterize this at kind of first blush, right? Do they understand this? And then instead of saying that this is that the public kind of thinks of me, insert the journalist there, because for the most part, it's going to be someone who doesn't have the experience that Martha and I do with science, but it may be someone who's just thrown on a science story and has absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And so, like you would for maybe a freshman seminar, think about bringing them up to speed on the context, the seminal papers, right? So you get them a little bit closer to something that's a mix of these 6 streams, right? Which is what you do. And I wanted to kind of briefly just put these in here. You'll have the slides, and I'll send them. But there Pew and other places, AAAS looks at engagement between kind of scientists and the public. This is something that I find really interesting in terms of the investment, or one of the questions to Martha was the responsibility, right, of scientists here. And there's arguably an overinvestment, right, in engaging with the public and being too kind of wasting too much of your bandwidth on engaging, right? Should you go interact with everyone who asks you a question on Twitter? Probably not. And then this I felt is really important too, because there's clearly a partisan kind of difference here in the way that the public in America engages with science and trusts science and kind of has confidence in what is kind of passed down from the ivory tower, or what is announced from a government agency. So these kinds of things are really important to kind of couch whatever it is that you're talking about, or you're writing for your op-ed, or you're trying to engage a reporter on. These things they're emotional, they're kind of front and center in the kind of topics being discussed today, right? I mean, you can't separate politics from anything. And so I think it's worth acknowledging it if it has any kind of bearing on the work that you're doing. So that was just a kind of preface, and maybe we want to return to that in a kind of Q&A format. But the first thing I want to talk about is kind of models and kind of the studies that were coming out during COVID. One of the first that I was really engaged with and ended up writing this piece on and doing a kind of a network analysis of the way that a study was kind of taken up by the right. And this existed on the left as well, right? If you are looking for something that confirms your beliefs, right, and you are an influencer, you are in a powerful position, you are probably going to be sharing that and not necessarily recognizing or understanding what the work is, who the authority is on that subject, what the scientific consensus is. And that's a danger that kind of exists, right, with social media and our media scape today. So this was an exploration of one of those early seroprevalence studies from Stanford. And I'm sure maybe you all had been following this out of Stanford and Ionitis and the folks over there. But it became really interesting because of how far it was kind of it was spread, right? It was spread by the Ann Coulters, the Alex Berensons, and the kind of right-wing media figures because it was saying something that was contradictory to what a lot of the science was saying, which was, of course, very uncertain and very confusing. But it was kind of politically something that was an easy argument to make, which was, you all are wrong, elite and liberals. It turns out that this is no deadlier than the flu. And look, here's a study that proves it. And then, of course, what it did was draw the attention of many in the community, scientific community, to go parse that study and point out all the problems with it. And so this was the social media, kind of the downstream effects of once it was out there. Later came a lot of the great work investigating the Stanford priming the pump, writing op-eds, trying to place this almost as a talking point. So that was a really interesting dynamic that I think underscores how politics and epidemiology can become super entwined. And there's plenty of stories there. And if you have context or past case studies or sources that we should be talking to, 100%, that's a perfect avenue to reach out and talk to us about that. And then we'll get more and more towards models, real models, as opposed to kind of say seroprevalence studies. This is, I would argue, how most of the public was engaging with models, quote unquote, during, I guess, the early months of the pandemic, or at least in 2020. I have that also from Northeastern researchers looking at traffic to this Washington Post simulation was among the most popular stories of 2020 on the pandemic. Why? Let's ask ourselves why, right? It's explanatory. It is science communication in essence, right? It's explaining and simulating what kind of infection looks like. That, I think, if you can break science journalism down into, right, everything from the investigative, say, seafood fraud and seafood slavery, all of that big J journalism, as my colleagues like to call it, down to a lot of the stuff that, say, I may have been doing for a Nature magazine assignment, which might have been just more explanatory. Hey, this new study's coming out in Nature. Let's help the public engage with it. Or Nature's readers, who are generally researchers like yourselves, how should they understand it if it's not exactly their field? And that becomes a lot more explanatory, a lot more kind of what are the bare bones takeaways. So that's one thing from the kind of models that I was seeing the public engage with, is it was very kind of basic in its presentation, and arguably probably stripping away a lot of the caveats and a lot of the confidence intervals and these kinds of things, right? And so we'll get to that because I think that's pretty important. And the reason I put decision makers in here too is because early on, there was a lot of disease forecasting in the news and from the COVID task force at the White House. And I was asking myself, and I'm sure you all were asking yourselves, wait, why are they relying on this model, right? Why, one, when there are competing, if that's the right word, groups working on forecasting everything from hospitalizations to deaths, this is not a kind of a one number kind of story, right? There is uncertainty baked into this, yet, and this comes over time and time again, right? Whether it's sea level rise or public health and infections, politicians and decision makers and generally the public tend to glom onto single numbers or a line on a chart as opposed to a cone of uncertainty, like the hurricane visualizations kind of really represent. There's some great work on that by Alberto Cairo, the journalism professor and data visualization designer. But the reason I bring up IHME was because when it was first published, this was a few months into it when the Washington Post was kind of digging into the task force, what models they were using, which models they were using for the high end worst case scenario projections, and which models they were using on the screen. this I found really interesting because a couple months later, sure enough, you had NPR and other folks working with people like Nicholas Wright, visualizing an ensemble of models, right? And you guys could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but when I first saw IHME's model, I was like blown away by the dashboard and the ease with which the general public could tweak certain things for their state or for deaths versus cases versus hospitalizations or ICU usage. And that went a long way, I posit, I think, in the popularity of that model. Now, perhaps it was that, perhaps it was networking with decision makers by UW, but I haven't read kind of anything great besides this kind of reporting on the reasons politicians go with certain models. But here's the thing, the media does it as well. The media loves a nice and tidy story. If you give us a model, we're not going to look and kick the tires and look at the kind of assumptions being made and rarely the input being made. We're going to just say, hey, you're saying X is going to happen in 2 months? Okay, sounds like a great story. This is according to a model from the University of blah, blah, blah. And here's a great quote I get from one of you. So the reason I'm kind of making this distinction is from the highest levels of government, the task force understanding projections, forming policy around projections, down to the media reporting on the output of a model, kind of no matter how authoritative or exhaustive it is. There is a sense that that kind of science is peer-reviewed and well understood and a consensus and kind of representing the gold standard on a certain thing. And that's partially, I think, the problem today with AI and kind of this veneer of the be all end all, right? That machines are giving us these answers. And it's been my experience that we don't properly couch it in the assumptions and the inputs and the underlying kind of decisions that were made in building that model or in making that projection. And so you all probably think about that every single day. However, in the midst of the pandemic, I was happy to encounter stories like this one, right? Where we started to kind of unpack a bit about what is assumed in a model, or how should the public engage with numbers and projections that are being thrown at them every day, right? And not just the public, but whether it's hospital leaders deciding how to shift resources or public health departments, right? I was talking to all those kinds of kind of stakeholders during the time, and it was clearly, obviously, a very, very confusing time, especially on the numbers, right? Because there were so many. And maybe there's a reckoning to be had about the way that we as a society can better assess risk, right? There's been a lot of great kind of stories and reporting on that. I loved this one in particular because it was a kind of introducing folks to what statistics is kind of based on, or a piece of statistics can be based on. And why that may be helpful in our own kind of risk assessment, in our own kind of understanding of uncertainty, right? So a couple things, and maybe we can ring in before I turn to other things like just critiques more in general, but I wanted to kind of end here with, so we were definitely hitting the public over the head with models early on. It was not a day went by that we weren't getting new projections. And there was little explanation of the assumptions. When I was trying to kick the tires on the curve fitting models and the projections and the forecasting that various modeling groups were using, you guys know this stuff, but I don't. And so I'm trying to read through the R or the Python code or whatever they're using, and the kind of methodology, which was very it was, preprints weren't even up yet on some of these models when they were published. So it was very hard to kick the tires if you even asked the questions, right? And so then you saw that some folks were extrapolating from cruise ship data. Some folks were extrapolating from Italy data. Some folks were extrapolating from Wuhan data, which of course you had to do in the earliest stages. But I guess back to what I was learning about good old Bayes, is we should be updating that. And I would argue, I think we should be updating the public on when those numbers are being updated, right? And as we know, and I'm not even touching it, how slow the CDC and HHS were on updating the public and updating guidance based on science. That's not just a book, that's an encyclopedia that could be written about the pandemic and the handling of scientific guidance during the pandemic. So maybe we don't have to focus on models. Maybe we can just talk about how the media's treatment of science worked during COVID, if you would find that helpful. Where dashboards or collaborations with reporters or your own public engagement, or where you saw the engagement of researchers, how that played a role in the pandemic, how it could be improved or how it did a good job. I'm interested in that. I was following Epi Twitter very closely for the last year and found it to be a really interesting, I hate to use the word self-correcting, but a very interesting kind of space for debate among folks that, some had the credentials to be having those debates and others maybe didn't. But it was interesting to watch that out in the open, right? So whether we want to talk about it in the context of models or in the context of science, I'd love to talk about that. So maybe I'll pause before I get into tips for the reporters and for engaging with reporters and the tips for the op-ed. Yeah, maybe I'll leave my questions up. What do you think? Am I totally off on some of these things? Was I under a rock for the last year and a half? James, you're muted.
We may be a little bit under a rock in the sense that, this working group was specifically created because there was a lot of epidemiological modeling being done. And there was a feeling that there needed to be a discussion forum for non-epidemiological modeling. And so there are people in the working group who do epidemiological modeling. We've had many epidemiological speakers, but we tend to focus on what happens inside individuals rather than between individuals. Although people like Chantal are very much involved in trying to understand mechanisms of viral infection, infectivity. But certainly the issues you brought up are very relevant. And I think we all have, I think almost everybody in the room will have opinions about them, strong ones. And also perhaps on how the press reports on these issues. Your example of that, those simulations and animations and the use of those to communicate, I'm not sure I saw that particular one. I remember actually an NPR site showing a similar kind of simulation and thinking about how effective that was at giving a sense of how infection works. And infection between cells within the body, actually, and infection between individuals in a population is very similar. They're both built around SIR models, although typically inside the body, the individuals don't move around quite as much. You don't have airplanes, although you have the bloodstream, which can do the same thing. And so I think these examples are ones that will be very familiar to people. And so I don't want to monopolize. I just say that I think you're right on target, and these are issues we've all grappled with. One thing that I heard some talks on very early on, and I was very impressed by, and I don't mean to exclude because I don't know who did all the work, but I remember there were teams at New York Times and also at The Economist that were doing a lot of work trying to get true excess death numbers early to try to correct COVID mortality statistics. And I heard some talks a year ago or more, a year and a half ago now, where they were talking about the efforts they were making to try to collect and aggregate data, which wasn't something that was obviously something. And Martha talked a little bit about going out and trying to pull data in and doing a data analysis within the journalists, as journalists. And that's something that perhaps scientists didn't think about so much. And you wear both hats as a data scientist and a journalist. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, so the Times just won a Pulitzer for public service for its COVID team, half of which was made up of former students of mine and those kinds of students, right? Unpaid staffers who were chasing down data at the county level. So, one large story in my world for COVID, probably your world too, was just how bad the data was throughout. And especially if we're trying to kind of infer and draw comparisons between states and counties. Not that everything should be made as a kind of antagonistic narrative, but it works for journalism, and you probably see it a lot. Conflict sells, and the race. Just look at our political coverage. We love horse races. So arguably not the best way to understand a pandemic is how much better I'm doing than Michigan, say. But the data was lacking, and so it became a challenge for everyone to go and chase that down. So I do mention as one of the successes for sure of media is the Atlantic's COVID tracking project. They also spun up the COVID racial data tracking project, which was something very few states were publishing. And it became clear why early on, which was the people with access to internet and to cars and to a flexible work schedule were the ones who were going to get vaccinated, for instance. And the same went for access to ventilators in high resource areas. And that kind of stuff was coming out in trickles. So I think if you are for sure a newsroom like the Times that was able to spin up and entice a lot of folks to work on a project like that, you grew your tentacles and were able to envision and execute that on a daily basis. And for sure, I think they deserved that recognition and Pulitzer for that because it was the de facto data set. I mean, beside them and Johns Hopkins and the Atlantic's COVID tracking project, I think were the three most important data sets from the media's perspective. And I think from folks who were trying to understand the statistics of cases and deaths and later on vaccinations. From your perspective, I'm sure there was different data that you would have loved to see. And I think, at least in our group and the data team, in the way that we approach, what Martha was saying really resonates because, these are simulations. To get the raw data, the actual data, we need the guidance for almost every large project that I'm on, and even some of the smaller ones. I get what my colleague calls a rabbi. I get one researcher. They're probably not going to be quoted in the story unless they really want to, and sure, we'll put them in. But someone who's just so generous with their time and willing to do a few phone calls with me, screen shares, looking over my shoulder in R or wherever I'm doing the analysis, to make sure. And sometimes they may be a professor, but they're getting to one of, I think it was Haley, someone had asked the question about the way that younger scientists can engage. I've had some great one-on-ones with research assistants, postdocs that have extra time or built into their positions, money and time to engage with media. And I think some of the best use of that time may not just be creating figures for the media, but maybe teaching the data teams, the data scientists at the media, what it is that you do and how you dig into a data set, how you create say a model from a paper, right? I think that could go a long way, because then you're teaching us something about, inspecting logistic regression outputs that we won't get unless we do it with one of your students or one of your postdocs or yourselves. That would be so valuable. We don't get that kind of stuff. But then what Martha had mentioned about the FOIAs too. So if it's not necessarily your raw data or your expertise that you can lend, it can be the expertise on, well, who actually has been collecting that data for the last 10 years? How could we put in a request to get that data? What are the right fields? I learned way too much about VTRACS, the vaccine tracking system, and the children's vaccines program. I learned way too much about immunization registries at the state level and how they feed into a whole alphabet soup of IZ gateways and data clearinghouses and all these things at the CDC level. Most of the success that I had was because I had academics holding my hand, explaining what the variables were, basically opening up the data dictionary and saying, this is what you need, and this is your denominator, and this is what you need to request. And then we got it, right? And so that was great. And that turns into collaborations as well. If it's in your interest to collaborate. I mean, one of my favorites is the Wall Street Journal and Weill Cornell working on the collecting bacteria from New York City subway stops. And they worked on that together, so much so that the Weill researchers asked the Wall Street Journal reporter to be on the paper because they had been collaborating for over a year on not just the kind of the study design, but the visualization and the communication of it once it came out. So that was a really cool collaboration, and I know there are some, right? So this one here this one on the Washington Post was just one guy from the Post, but this one from the New York Times had a whole bunch of I don't have it pulled up, but if you visit here, the methodology explains how many people, mathematicians and epidemiologists, that they worked with. But I do want to really quickly, before we go to the next section, I do want to address this, what your working group does, and maybe a kind of, I think a lesson learned from what COVID coverage gave us, which was perhaps too much of an emphasis on the epidemiology and the forecasting in populations, and where, as soon as we almost kind of got that out of our system, or kind of understood where those kind of spikes were leading and how those infections were happening at the macro level, did we then start to question things like aerosols versus fomites? Then we began, the school reopening debate. My wife's a teacher, so I was in the thick of it, hearing how we kind of, went down to the more kind of micro, the classroom level, as opposed to, say, the county level. And I think that's where we could have gotten into a lot more discussion early on the biology of it. I think one of the most, and I don't include it here, but one of the most powerful visualizations, which just won an award, was El País in Spain, which built a 3D model of aerosols in a classroom and what occurs when you open windows. Those kinds of things, right? So whether it's you, and I know that's a little bit different maybe from what you all do, but communicating that in terms of, if the herd is all chasing this, we should be looking at this. That is a strong pitch for an op-ed in terms of you all writing it and penning it, or for where the Atlantic should be focusing its next big feature story. They made their name, and Ed Yong won a Pulitzer for the Atlantic, writing those kinds of big viewpoints on what the pandemic was and our experience of it. And one of my favorite writers was Zeynep Tufekci this pandemic, because precisely, she was raising unpopular opinions among at least the consensus and liberals for sure, which was that we should be wearing masks outside. She made the argument early on that the beach, especially a not crowded beach, is probably one of the safest places to be, and that we should be outdoors. That was unpopular in a month or so that she was writing that. But those kinds of, if the herd's going left and you go right, show us that that's kind of where the data lies, or what the argument's kind of missing, or what the kind of debate out there is missing. So anyway, that's where I think we may have put too much emphasis on the epidemiology. So this, I endorse everything Martha said about the FOIAs and not spinning and finding the right reporter for sure. Here's just some other tips I have. Updating your websites, your research, with the latest. Sometimes I see stuff that's 10 years out of date. So let us know, like by throwing it up there, or whether it's Google Scholar or a downloadable CV, that's really helpful. And of course, the research that you're on currently, like if you published something 2 years ago, but I know it may have been in press for 2 years, so you haven't touched that subject in 4 years, update me in the bio what you're working on before I take the time to write an email to you. And I know sometimes the emails may seem curt or short. We, like you, are on deadlines, and we try. I think, yes, Martha's right about the University Press Office. I think they definitely vary. I know a lot of colleagues that have become press officers, and some who kind of understand the cadence a lot better than others. But for sure, proactively finding us is a really good idea. And yeah, short list of must-read papers, must contact colleagues, and data and figures if you can share them. That's been really helpful for almost any story, just so I know, what is the seminal kind of paper here? If there can be one, or if there are 5, I want to know who the go-to folks are, and especially who have written on it or published on it recently. And you don't always need a new study to make news. You can definitely offer context, or like I said, if everyone's looking left and we should be looking right, tell us that. Tell us what we're missing about the kind of work that you're doing. And anecdotes and challenges and stories and conflict and all of that. And of course, from my perspective, data, right? If I can talk to all of you and put 5 of you in the story, but I also get a unique data set to publish with the story that no one's shown before, and we can maybe build a model, a simulation of something occurring in the body, let's do it. That'll be unique. John has his hand up, so I should probably call him.
Yeah, something you said about having the postdocs available. You're on the journalist side, but you had the postdocs available, and then I think about how scientists are trained, education. Question is, could you develop an outline of a curriculum that you would think all scientists should complete, that teaches them to think about communicating their results before they have their results? My assumption is scientists don't think about news releases until the work is all done. And then they don't know what to tell you, and they can't answer your questions. But as a discipline, and particularly on the modeling side, are there certain things that you could teach us we ought to do every day that captures that's thinking about how would I communicate this to the public if it ever did become important?
There's a whole mini industry now of folks that'll go around and teach folks how to communicate, right? Science communication is kind of a pretty big thing here. and that could be how to spin up a blog, how to be on Twitter, how to engage at like science cafes and give little talks at like the 92nd Street Y in New York, or like your local cafe. That all is out there, and for sure. And if I can drag up some stuff, I'll send some stuff. But I think the conflict that I see is, if you all aren't incentivized to do it, then you're doing it on borrowed time. You're maybe you don't feel like you actually need to. Maybe it's not your responsibility to. Maybe that's what the press office is there for. So I would think that it needs to, if you want to be doing it, it needs to be baked in early on. I mentioned the postdocs who have a slice of their time specifically for engaging with media. There was a Knight Foundation grant, and University of Washington won one for disinformation research. And a big slice of it was so that they could specifically work with media outlets to publish figures, to share data, and to offer quotes, to the extent that it was actually a collaboration, right? So I hear of something like the Plandemic video being published on YouTube. I reach out early to the research group. They have funds to actually work with me for several weeks on that project. And then we publish something that shows the kind of the infectiousness of that video, along with figures, along with quotes, and it becomes a real collaboration. That can't be expected, as from every research group, right? I can't expect you all to give me 3 weeks of your time and unlimited data to tell this story, right? It's generally going to be a couple phone calls, and maybe I'll get around to sending you some stuff. It doesn't always work that way. So so I always think about like the competing incentives. And of course, I talk to a lot of assistant professors. I have a lot of friends chasing tenure. If it's not rewarded as part of the tenure process, then why are you going to do it? It's a lot of work. Some places are changing that, right? Some places are rewarding, non-tenured or tenure track for doing op-eds. I think that's a great move, because arguably that's going to make a much larger splash than a paper in a paper period. Even if it's a Nature paper is going to get you a ton of credentials with your colleagues, but not necessarily with the public. So I think it has to probably be both, but I don't see the former being rewarded. And Twitter is a whole other question, right? Or media appearances. I don't know. So I think it comes down to incentives, but maybe I'm naive. Does that answer it? I don't know.
Other questions? I see it.
Maybe I just have a comment. I think, Aleszu, it's a great point that you make, that these sorts of things typically are not rewarded. But, I think most people want to do what they think is the right thing to do, rather than just what gets them tenure. Right? It's ideally we can do both.
I think we especially in a moment of crisis where something needs to be conveyed and this stuff needs to kind of see the light of day, we're going to do it, and you all should do it. And I would hope that the resources are out there, and I see them for science communication. And from talking to folks like me and Martha or Philip and other folks, so that you can leapfrog and you can save yourself some time. I think she's right? You're going to have to reach out to maybe 10 or 20 reporters to get one who will really pay attention. But that may not end up kind of coming to fruition. So that hurts, I think, but you just got to keep at it. I mean, my career is based off of pitching, and 1 out of 5, right? Just like, and I've written grants, right? I've gotten more grants rejected. I don't think I ever had a grant accepted. So, but whatever, right? Like you just keep going. It's the same with journalism. I was a freelancer for like 5 years, more than half the stories 4 out of 5 are rejected. So we need to kind of just stay motivated and stay on target, all of us. But this, I think I've had a lot of success kind of showing this around. The op-ed is a very formulaic format in journalism. I think you can get a lot of mileage out of wrapping one idea, generally one idea, and simple. And you all will have the slides, but I think these can make it pretty far. And you probably saw during the pandemic just how many scientists were getting published, right? Because we turned, and for sure the media, some of the media was turning them for guidance and for expertise. If we weren't going to be getting it from Messonnier at CDC, then we would turn to someone at an academic institution who wasn't muzzled, who could talk. And so that's where you can be very helpful too. And in that way, you have editors there who can help. So if it's a strong enough point and you pitch it kind of in an alluring enough way, you can get help from the editors there. So this is USA Today, right? We publish scientists a lot. The Times was doing it throughout the whole pandemic. And then of course, there's places like The Conversation, which I find really helpful too. And so if you haven't checked that place out, The Conversation is a great, I think, resource. And it gets kind of republished and syndicated out to other outlets. And they have editors on staff who can help you, much like, Nature and Scientific American can, if you want to write up a kind of a viewpoint for them. So that's another avenue for engagement. Anyway, I hope it was helpful. I'm always game to talk. My email is up at the top, so here. But thank you for the invite. I really appreciate talking, and I hope it wasn't too basic. I appreciate the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. It was enlightening. And if there are no more questions, I hope we have an opportunity to talk to you again. I'm sure that I hope you'll get some emails from people and some ideas. I think Reinhard and I definitely have some things we might like to talk about with you. I'm sure others would as well.
Please. All right, great. Well, I look forward to talking, everyone.
Thank so much.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.